Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, the Present Flight Podcast, continuing our History of Warfare series with Terminal Philosophy. It's been a while since we last dealt with naval combat, but on the eve of the First Punic War, given where we left off in our discussion last time at the Peloponnesian War, a lot has happened. And given the importance of naval combat in the First Punic War, I felt it was apropos to explain how naval warfare had developed since then. So just to briefly pick up where we left off, at the end of the Peloponnesian War, the key naval vessel is the Trireme, and the Trireme means a ship with three banks of oars, so one stacked upon the other, sort of like a triple-decker bus, where there's oarsmen at each level, which propels the ship forward. There were basically technically four formations or maneuvers that you could use on the Trireme. Two were offensive and two were defensive. The two offensive methods were the Decouplis and the Perupolis. Now, one of the problems with ancient naval warfare is a lot of these terms aren't very well defined, at least with the surviving material that we have. It appears that the Decouplis was a method in whereby if you had a battle line of enemy triremes, you would have almost like a spear where each ship is right behind the other in a straight line. And you would launch yourselves in these straight lines, and as you made contact with the enemy ships, you'd veer to the port or to the starboard just enough to, hopefully with the beak of your trireme, shear off their oars, leaving them stuck. And then as you passed by them, the first trireme would pass by, the second trireme would then turn to the starboard of the port and then ram them. If that didn't happen, they'd all go through, turn around, and then ram the ship, which, as you can imagine, would take some serious seamanship skills. The word Perupolis is a little more complicated. It literally means to sail around, and is a derivative of the Greek word peripateo, which means to walk around. It seems that the Perupolis is a flanking maneuver. So you would flank the enemy fleet and then ram them on the side. So rather than charging them directly, you're trying to flank them. And we will be seeing this in the Punic Wars. The Carthaginians love to try to flank the Romans in these long, almost like a crescent formation, where the two horns, that seems to be the Perupolis. It's a reverse crescent where the two horns try to surround the enemy and then attack them from the side of the rear, whereas the center is kind of refused. We would see that formation on land with Hannibal at Cannae. There's two defensive formations that were invented to protect against such an attack. One was a double line. So if the enemy tried a Decouplis, you would charge in and then flank, shear off the oars of one of the lines of triremes, but the second line would then hit you, and you'd be dead in the water. The danger is that this double line defense, while it would counter the Decouplis, would be vulnerable to the reverse crescent of the Perupolis, where you could be flanked by a longer battle line. And then there was a circular formation, kind of a refused formation, where around, imagine like the spokes on a wheel, where the triremes look like spokes on a wheel, and all their prows are pointed outward, which means they're not really able to be rammed or pierced. So though the latter two defensive formations, as far as I can tell, don't really have a name, but some permutation of any of those four was what we saw dominant on naval warfare with the age of the trireme. And these tactics would, of course, be vital and viable long into the age of the fours and fives, the quadremes and the quincremes. But the first major innovation that we see is the quadreme and the quincreme. Now, as with the trireme, there's a debate on who invented them. There seems to be no debate that the quincreme was invented by Dionysius of Syracuse, Dionysius the Tyrant. The quadreme seems to be a contested invention. Some attribute it to Carthage, some attribute it to Dionysius. I think what I would say is much like radar in 1940, where the Germans, the English, and the Americans were all independently inventing radar based on lines of inference that were already well known to anybody who understood the theoretical mathematics behind it. It's quite likely, given the sea prowess of both the Greeks and the Carthaginians, they were operating on independent lines and coming to the same conclusion. It's not like that hasn't happened before, which could account for the disputed origin of the two. What we then see is what makes these ships 4s and 5s is how they're stacked. The classic interpretation is that it's a 4 or 5 decker bus, basically. This has led some historians to argue that we shouldn't view these as decks, because in some literature, some of the gargantuan Hellenistic ships are called 40s, and it's difficult to envision a ship at sea that's essentially 40 stories tall with 40 decks. And some people say, well, instead of viewing them as decks, we should view them as the number of rowers. So we have two competing theories on how a quadreme and a quinquereme looked. One is the classic deck model, where you have 5 banks of rowers. But there's another competing model which says there are actually still just 3 banks, but a 4 has 4 rowers, where there's 2 groups of rowers on the top bank. And then the quinquereme still has 3 banks, and then there's 2 rowers on the top bank and the middle bank. That's a very interesting question, and I haven't really thought about it enough to decide which way I think that should be resolved. I'm still somewhat partial to the 4s and 5s being banks, in part because each of those ships is significantly larger than a trireme. If we look at Polybius's account, Roman and Carthaginian quinqueremes had crews as much as 300, which I think the Athenian trireme had a crew of 200. So it seems like it must have been a larger ship in order to hold roughly 50% more crew. So opening up with where the basic naval tactics and the invention of the quinquereme and the quadreme, what are some of your thoughts on that terminal philosophy?
Yeah, it's been interesting to prepare for this episode. I think it's always important to point out first and foremost that the Carthaginians were known to have the dominant seafaring capabilities for several centuries, even before war with Rome became inevitable. The Carthaginians, as you know, were the descendants of the Phoenicians, since the late Bronze Age, and the Phoenicians facilitated most of the sea trade in the Eastern Mediterranean. They are one of the few surviving powers from the late Bronze Age collapse, in part due to this trading empire that they had established. So the tradition of shipbuilding, sailing, navigating is something that the Carthaginians inherited from their Phoenician ancestors. The Romans, on the other hand, as we have touched on in several past episodes, were the masters of land warfare, political organization, manpower, logistics, and just dynamics in general. The Romans had contact with Carthage, obviously, early on in the form of trade, but it wasn't until contact with Pyrrhus that Rome starts to consider naval power as something that would become more and more indispensable in broader campaigns and operations. As for the First Punic War at large and its naval tactics, the most apparent factor in the development of naval tactics, or at least for me, is this introduction of the Roman Corvus, which is translated to raven. It's basically an attached boarding plank that the Romans used to board and take over other ships. And this was employed in both in the quadreme and the triremes that the Romans built. From what I was able to gather from the ancient historian Polybius, who was probably the best historian on the naval matters between Rome and Carthage, the Romans were not as elaborate in their naval tactics as the Greeks were. They were interested in getting close enough to either board enemy ships, to ram them, or in general, just mimicking a land battle and maximizing their advantage with manpower and taking over enemy ships. There's also, Polybius talks about in his histories as well, that Romans like to damage ships with missile fire, with ballistae and things like that. So they also, of course, built their quadremes and triremes with the bronze rams at the front, which was typical for the age. But yeah, from what you were saying earlier, yeah, there doesn't seem to be any clear origin for who originally built the quadremes. Of course, however, there was a Carthaginian quadreme that had been beached in Messina, And this is where the Romans basically got their copy for building a navy with the quadremes. I think they already knew how to build triremes, according to Polybius, but this was a different sort of naval breakthrough that they had by just having a carbon copy right there in front of them. But based off of Polybius's writings, it seems more clear that the Carthaginians were more interested in these more elaborate flanking maneuvers from Hanno, like the Perupolis, or the crescent-shaped formation, the Decouplis. The Romans, I guess it depends on each battle from the Punic War, but the Romans honestly were trying to maximize their the use of their marines, and having these quick and more decisive victories, whereas the Carthaginians were a bit more methodical. Of course, the Romans were ultimately victorious in their naval operations against Carthage, but honestly, it had more to do with the ability to raise manpower, and also manpower at home to build ships. They had a much easier time replacing ships more easily than the Carthaginians did. Those are just sort of my initial impressions of Polybius on this.
Okay. The next major innovation with regards to naval tactics, because again, we see that there's a combination of ramming tactics using the four methods we've discussed, two of offense, two of defense. And then, of course, boarding, the first major naval battle described in Western history, which we already covered, the Battle of Salamis, does include a lot of ship-to-ship fighting, though. That's usually not the initial phase that the Greeks would use, especially with the Athenians and later the Carthaginians. They definitely preferred the more nimble ramming techniques. But with larger ships, with fours and fives or quadremes and quincremes, we begin to see the ability to put siege weapons on them. Now, the earliest use that I'm aware of any general or admiral putting siege weapons on ships was Alexander putting his oxybelles on triremes to bombard the walls of Tyre. These were triremes he got from Byblos and Sidon to have a sort of 360 assault on the island fortress of Tyre. And we begin to see with both the Carthaginians and Dionysius the Syracusan in the Greco-Punic War, so they also are able to put missile weapons on the ships. Now, it needs to be remembered that most of these ballistae weapons are not going to sink an enemy ship. It's not like a ship of the line opening up a broadside and then just sinking a ship straight up. That's not going to happen. Most of these are going to be either anti-personnel weapons, where you soften up the enemy ship before you board it, or maybe possibly directed at enemy oars to smash them so the ship is immobile, which either opens it up for a ramming maneuver or opens it up for a boarding maneuver. And so they also come in very handy for sieges. We see that in the Eastern Mediterranean or the Hellenistic period, especially with Demetrius the Besieger, the use of siege towers. The Romans will use siege towers on ships during their siege of Syracuse in 212 BC, where when we get to the Second Punic War, we'll hear about how Archimedes played havoc with the Romans, but they were capable of putting siege towers on ships. One of the earliest examples is Demetrius' siege of Rhodes, where in addition to building the land-bound Helepolis, he puts siege towers and missile weapons on his fours and fives as they besiege the seaward side of Rhodes. And of course, the Rhodian defenders have determined resistance with their own fleet, and catapults drive off Demetrius. But at this point, we see that the ships are now large enough, which I think is in part also in favor of arguing for them being deckers, 4 and 5 deckers, rather than just 4 and 5 rowers. They're now large enough to hold catapults and siege towers, which gives them a decisive advantage at sea. And as you've already mentioned, the Corvus, which is the Roman innovation. The Romans, as Polybius states, are not really sea people. They're not really used to the sea. And he argues that Roman determination generally works against men, But when to quote, to paraphrase Polybius, when you sort of ignore Poseidon, bad things happen. You can't act like that in the face of the gods, or in this case, the sea. But what's interesting about the Corvus is that the Romans tried to turn a sea battle into a land battle, and that's not without precedent. We do see some of that, like at the Battle of Salamis. But we see that the Romans, realizing they were initially outgunned by the Carthaginians, so to speak, decided to even the odds. And in the early days, Polybius reports that the Carthaginians were just completely befuddled by the Corvus. And the construction of the Corvus was that there was a long boarding plank. So the plank was about 1.2 meters wide and 11 meters long. It was on a pole that swiveled, which was about 7 meters tall and 20 centimeters thick. The Corvus had a knee-high railing for the soldiers, and then there was a large iron spike at the end of the Corvus. As it was let down and it was raised and lowered by a pulley system, it stuck fast into the enemy ship. Now, the Corvus is only really used in the First Punic War, and there's no reports that it was used afterwards. Many scholars have argued that Rome's numerous naval disasters were the result of the Corvus, either because it made the ships heavy and unbalanced, because when the Corvus was at rest, it was either on the port or the starboard side of the ship, which meant that one side was heavier than the other, and in stormy waters they would sink. Also, at the Battle of Drepana, they were too heavy and slow and sluggish to move, in part because they had boarding troops and the Corvus, and in part because they had stores of supply as well, that the Carthaginians could use their superior maneuvering skills to defeat the Romans. Now, there's some debate as to whether the Corvus was abandoned during the war or just after the war. So, for example, at the Battle of Drepana, there's no mention made of the Corvus, and it's a Roman defeat, which leads some scholars to think that, well, maybe they didn't have a Corvus and that's why they lost. But by the same token, it could be that they did have a Corvus and it made them heavy and unwieldy and they lost for that reason. And if we look at the Battle of Aguza, which determined the final outcome of the First Punic War, we don't read of the Corvus being used either. And we know that eventually Carthage as well used boarding marine troops. At the Battle of Drepana, Polybius says that they had their own elite troops to board Roman ships. Some people will then say, well, because the Romans are still boarding enemy ships, they must be using the Corvus. But the Carthaginians boarded Roman ships and didn't use the Corvus. So, while it is a bit of a riddle, there's two things we know for sure. After the First Punic War, the Corvus was not used. And we do know that for all the Roman sea battles up to Drepana, they used the Corvus. Now, whether it was used during and after Drepana, but before the end of the First Punic War, is, I think, still an open question, and one that, in my research, I wasn't really able to find an answer to.
Yeah, you're right. You're right to point out earlier that the use of ballistae on quadremes and triremes and quinqueremes was not. They weren't used to outright just sink a ship, as you say. It's not as if you'd have multiple ballistae on a ship and then you just open up a broadside barrage in hopes of sinking a ship. I think most modern people have this image in their head of these broadside barrages, and that's how things were done in the Iron Age. But yeah, that's certainly not the case. It was more used to soften up a position like you would artillery in a land battle, and then you send in troops, or you go in with your ramming maneuver, or you go in and board with a certain force of Marines. I doubt it was actually possible to damage a ship enough with ballistic missile fire. I mean, I'm sure it probably happened on some anecdotal situations, but I think it was more used to just damage the crew and things like that. It's also interesting to point out this predicament with the Roman Corvus, because as we probably both read in Polybius and some of the various documentaries available on the naval warfare in the Punic War, the Roman Corvus, it seems, was also a source of various problems at sea. I mean, for one, the weight of it, is about 10 or 11 meters long. The weight of it has made it sort of unruly while trying to navigate seas. And, this is still in the age where even with the introduction of quadremes and quinqueremes, there was still the problem of weather, and ships just weren't built to sustain storms like they were in the age of sail. And also Rome had the problem of inexperienced sailors themselves, not quite as disciplined as the not the Phoenicians, but the Carthaginians had underneath their control. So yeah, I also had a bit of a tough time determining the length of how long the Romans decided to use the Corvus, because Drepana, I don't know that I would blame the defeat of the Roman navy necessarily on the poor use of the Corvus so much as it was the formation that they found themselves in. Most historians describe Drepana as where the Romans came in during the night, and there were issues with weather, and they had a difficulty being stationary while waiting for the Carthaginian navy in the early morning. And so this gave, and they were up against the western coast of Sicily, and then they were on the western coast, and then to their left, this is where the Carthaginians came out, and they were able to, maximize their strengths, which were, these more elaborate maneuvers and attacking a singular Roman formation from multiple sides, like you would in a land battle. So, I also had a difficult time determining this use of the Corvus. I think it's one thing. It's interesting to point out, though, that the Carthaginians didn't really have a good answer for this other than trying to outmaneuver the Romans and testing the sort of the discipline and the skills of the Roman crews on their quadremes and their ships in general. Because the Romans still did use triremes at this point, and both sides still used triremes because triremes were sometimes faster, but they lacked, obviously the manpower that you could put on a quadreme or a quadreme. So I kind of have an inconclusive impression on the use of the Corvus, but again, it was as Polybius said in his histories, that this was sort of the best the Romans could do in order to mimic a land battle on sea, because again of these. By the time the First Punic War happened, we saw with Pyrrhus of Epirus how well the Romans could raise an army and replace these huge losses. So this translated to the sea as well, and there was plenty of manpower on the Italian mainland to replace the loss of ships. But as for myself, with these battles of like Mylae and Battle of Agates, there doesn't seem to be clear evidence that the Corvus was used. And what seems to be a bit more apparent is that the Romans were beginning to use more dynamic formations and tactics themselves. So they're starting to mimic the Carthaginians a bit. But it didn't, that was sort of a slow innovation on the part of the Romans, because I think they were quite determined in, coming in with swift victories with, ramming and boarding ships and the use of limited use of ballistae. And then, this will be covered in a later episode, of course, but the sort of the grand Mediterranean campaign of going to war with various pirate factions, the Romans ended up using more Carthaginian tactics. Yes, of course, they're still boarding and things like that, but they honestly, in typical Roman fashion, started borrowing good ideas from their enemy and putting a Romanized version and aesthetic over them.
Yes. Now, when it comes to the construction of the fours and the fives, and ancient shipping in general, Theophrastus states that vessels were constructed of three kinds of wood, fir, pine, and cedar. He says that fir was fleshier and had fewer fibers. Pine was less fleshy but had more fibers. Because of this, he said that warships were made of fir because they were light, and it was lighter and then the merchant vessels were made of pine, as it resisted, I guess, wear and tear at sea. And the problem with fir, though, is that it was soft and soaks up wood or water, and so at sea the wood would just become useless, which is why ships were often beached on land or put in dry dock. Now, when it comes to the construction of a ship like this, first the keel was laid, and then there were ribs laid on top of it, and then there was tusk pieces for the ram. And then as you built like the side of the ship, you built it with wooden planking that was joined together by wooden tenons, and a tenon is a projecting member in a piece of wood or other material for insertion into a moisture to make a joint, and wooden dowels. And they use that to hold the planks together. Now, because the ships would rot out and get saturated with water, we see the use of dry docks. One of the earliest uses was Athens and its dock, the Piraeus. The most elaborate and largest was the great harbor of Carthage. So if we look at the great harbor of Carthage, and even on a smaller scale, the Athenian harbor, there's a certain standards of construction that they would use. They would first choose a covert inlet where they would build their dry dock. The entrance to the sea would be narrowed by a mole, and a mole is a raised spit of earth or rock. Alexander the Great built two moles, to besiege Tyre. He built siege towers on them. They're generally either right below the water or right above the water. And as they narrowed the entrance of the cove as much as they could, they built towers and walls in order to repel any other naval attack on the harbor. And so it would protect their vessels from attack. And presumably, also what a mole would do is if the enemy used fire ships, and that was also a tactic to use once an enemy's at the beach or at harbor, you'd launch fire ships at them. Presumably, they would get caught at the mole and then not do any damage in the actual harbor itself. And then at the narrowest point, they drag a chain across it, an iron chain, which would prevent ships from leaving or entering, which would create a very strong fortified position. The harbor itself had the great harbor of Carthage, built along these lines, had two great dry docks, one for merchant vessels and one for military vessels. At the seaward entrance, the Carthaginians had about 20 meters across that could be then chained to prevent enemy ships from entering. And the way it was built as you went deeper in. So as you entered in the harbor, the first thing you'd see would be the commercial sector where the dry docks for the commercial ships are. And then you'd see further in a military dry dock. Now, in the center of this inlet or cove, there would be an island which would serve as the admiral's headquarters. The headquarters would be constructed with a tower that would be able to overlook the walls of the harbor so they could see out to sea and give them maximum situational awareness of the area. And according to the ancient sources, the Carthaginian ship sheds could hold up to 200 quinqueremes. And the ship sheds were about 5.9 or 6 meters distant from each other. And the entire circuit of the quay would have been 1,100 meters. So this is a vast port. And of course, Carthage utilized all of the classic harbor techniques that the Athenians and their Phoenician forefathers used, but perfected it on a grand scale. And we see that presumably Syracuse would have had a harbor of a similar capacity, given the history that we've already covered of the Greco-Punic Wars and the great fleets that, for example, Dionysus and Agathocles could put to sea. And so the ships are most vulnerable either in harbor or on the beach, as we saw at Aegispotami in the Peloponnesian War, and as we saw with the Romans at Drepana, being caught either on the beaches or near the beaches was pretty much a death sentence in ancient warfare. So speed was always of the essence at naval sea warfare. And I think it would appear, if you look at the First Punic War, if there's the general phases are phase one, Rome is not very good at sea and is evening the playing field by using the Corvus. Either because the Corvus was an impediment at Drepana or not used at Drepana or whatever, they lost. And for a few years, they didn't go to sea anymore, conceding it to Carthage. At that time, we have the exploits of Hannibal the Rhodian, who had a lighter, faster ship, basically taunting the Romans outside of Lilybaeum, which was being besieged. The Romans eventually built a mole, which caused Hannibal's ship to stick fast, where they captured it, and they reverse engineered a lighter, faster Quincy, which they would then use at the Battle of Aguza. And by perfecting, there's a line where Polybius says about the Battle of Aguza. He says, but the respective state of equipment of the two sides was exactly the converse of what had happened in the Battle of Drepana, and the result of the battle was therefore naturally reversed also. Which would indicate to me, given that he describes the Carthaginians using the Decouplis at the Battle of Drepana, that the Romans had, at this point, doctrinally changed their methodology. Instead of using boarding techniques to the exclusion of everything else, they decided to beat the Carthaginians at their own game by being better seamen, more competent at the use of the ram. And that would seem to be that the Romans went through three phases. One, the boarding phase, where they only boarded ships. The second phase was rethinking what they were doing. And then the third phase was preferring the lighter, new Rhodian model of Quincy, and then perfecting the Carthaginian naval tactics. And this broader trend towards lighter ships we will see continue into the Roman Empire with the Liburna, and then into the Middle Ages with the Byzantine Roman. And it seems that overall, the advantages conferred by larger vessels, and the fact that they could hold catapults, or the fact that they could hold siege towers, or the fact that they could hold marines, was ultimately more of a detriment than an advantage, for at least two reasons. One, these ships were large and unseaworthy and would sink in bad weather, as we saw with Rome's numerous naval disasters. And second of all, being large and unwieldy, it left them vulnerable to flanking maneuvers, as we saw at Drepana. So it would seem that the age of the giant sea vessels, which we see the highlight of in the First Punic War, was also the beginning of the end. And it would seem that the giant naval vessels were replaced by lighter, faster ships, and we see this trend beginning with Hannibal the Rhodian.
Right, absolutely. It is really interesting to consider the various upkeep problems that came with entire navies made up of triremes, quadremes, and quinqueremes. Of course, the Carthaginians, as you had previously mentioned, had perhaps the greatest dry docks of the ancient world. Carthage, Athens, Syracuse, and at one point I had read, although I never was able to follow this up with a lot more research, but it was either Naples or one of the colonies on the southern end of Italy had a dry dock as well. And this was used under various powers, but including Pyrrhus, because Pyrrhus had multiple, at least for logistical purposes, if anything, he had, he needed dry docks to maintain and to move around his armies. But Carthage, Athens, and Syracuse, so far as I'm aware, had the best capability of upkeeping fleets. Carthage, with one dry dock for merchant vessels and then the other one with the military vessels, as you mentioned. I mean, this is you can imagine the manpower that's dedicated from the city alone just to the maintenance of all these ships. So it's an incredible. It's just an incredible amount of responsibility on the economics of all of these cities to upkeep fleets, and that's just one aspect of the workforce. But yes, also, as you had mentioned, in this broader analysis of the inception and evolution of Roman naval tactics is interesting to consider as well, because in this first phase, Rome was new to naval tactics, and they were basically just trying to come in with some of these quasi brute force tactics with ramming or boarding ships. And Drepana was kind of, if anything, quite the test phase for Rome, because, again, it seems like an unfortunate combination between weather, inexperienced sailors, and I guess you could say, a poorly tested building phase of the Corvus made its use difficult. I think, if Roman formations were able to come in close enough to some of these Carthaginian vessels and board them, Rome would typically win. But if they had a few unfavorable conditions that made it hard for a Roman crew to maneuver their ships, well, then they were just simply outskilled by the Carthaginians. So, and then, of course, with the second phase, Rome starts, it would appear, I think we can at least agree for the time being, that the Corvus was a temporary answer to Carthaginian naval supremacy. And what starts to happen is Rome starts to innovate with more tactics of its own, and breaking up these sort of larger, maybe this is a bad comparison, but sort of breaking up these larger sort of Persian-esque, bloated formations, and starting to getting more dynamic with flanking maneuvers and feigned retreats, which Hanno was well known for in the Punic Wars, and to try and get the enemy to bait them into certain areas, or have them fall for certain tactics. And then, of course, Rome does innovate with faster ships. One thing that I was kind of surprised during some of the research for this is that, really the age of large vessels was ultimately not to be, because I think, honestly, the build quality and the materials available to make larger and larger ships was just, if anything, it was just disastrous. Largely due to just weather. These ships had a hard time, even smaller, lighter, and faster ships even had a hard time surviving really rough storms. And, one thing that makes one sharp contrast between the Carthaginians and the Romans is this Roman willingness to lose so many men at sea, because Rome, it does not appear that Rome had this, a network of dry docks, or had an affinity for building dry docks. What they really were interested in is just replacing losses and just throwing more men in the Carthaginian naval meat grinder and just wearing them down. Kind of an interesting tactic, given that it's almost quantity versus quality, like we've talked about in various other conflicts. But again, what makes Rome victorious at sea is this willingness to innovate, and that comes in the form of the negation of the Corvus, the introduction of using tactics rather than these overloaded and bloated formations just as a singular thing that the Carthaginians would have to chip away at. And then third is just using better ships and downsizing a lot of these quadremes and quadremes and quinqueremes, because it appears that larger ships were they made an appearance, but then they went away quickly, because there just weren't a stable build, and it was easier to maintain multiple smaller ships than it was to maintain fewer larger ships, and that does seem to be the common trend and pattern here.
One thing that also needs to be pointed out is, if in the same way that in modern times we might look at a skyscraper, a nuclear reactor, or an aircraft carrier as the pinnacle of a feat of engineering and complex systems, in antiquity, that was exactly the role played by vessels at sea, especially war vessels. Because not only, unlike, say, a merchant vessel, did you have all of the complexity of the construction of the ship, but you also had to, as we see in the Hellenistic and late classical period, siege towers, missile weapons, very, very complex systems. So a single ship was itself a complex system, and a fleet was a series of complex systems. This was literally the most sophisticated that you could get in antiquity, and it was a Herculean effort. This is why only so few ancient nations could field navies. We look at, of course, the Phoenician city-states prior to the Persian Wars with Greece, who were doing this. We didn't actually mention them, in part because there's just too little to be said. The ancient Minoans, they also were known for their fleets. And then we saw with the rise of Athens and Greece, and then Carthage and Syracuse in the Western Mediterranean, and finally Rome. There's a huge hurdle. It's almost like an aircraft carrier. To actually have an aircraft carrier, there's only, I think, a dozen nations around the world that can even have even one aircraft carrier, because the cost of purchase and maintenance is just so high. And so, given that the Mediterranean was more or less an inland sea for all practical purposes, the nations that could take advantage of that were given the competitive advantage over those that couldn't. And so that would explain in part the rise of the Greeks, the rise of the Carthaginians, and later the rise of the Romans. One other factor to keep in mind is as ships get larger and larger and fleets get larger and larger, Polybius states at the end of his history of the First Punic War was the largest war in history, even larger than the war against Xerxes. So as far as he can tell, that's the largest war that's ever been fought, where I think something like 700 Roman vessels were constructed and 500 Carthaginian vessels were constructed. These numbers are just mind-boggling for ancient times. You also have to be ridiculously wealthy, either through commercial exchange or, taxation of a large empire. So Rome and Persia have a large land-based tax, and the Carthaginians and the Greeks have mercantile connections to generate revenue. So it's a vast investment of financial resources to build a fleet. And lastly, one other possible reason why lighter, smaller ships were eventually preferred over the larger ships is the ancient Mediterranean, unlike, say, Northern Europe, Scandinavia, Russia, Eastern Europe, and England, were not covered with forests. One can easily envision, especially in the current state of North Africa and Egypt today, that this rush for gargantuan ships and gargantuan fleets in the Eastern and Western Mediterranean denuded the regions of trees. And so you get to a certain point where even if you wanted to build a quinquereme, you could only maybe build one or two, and that's not really a fleet. And then you'd be swamped by a horde of smaller vessels. So while I'm not aware of any direct military historian account of this, I have read various ecological deep green people that argue that the ancient Romans, not exclusively, but participated in a large deforesting process. And one of the leading causes of deforestation was shipbuilding. So it is also a possibility, though a little less certain than changes in naval tactics, that the pressure for smaller vessels was the result of a scarcity of wood. And if you have to import timber from Germany, Scandinavia, and Eastern Europe, then the Romans are just not going to be able to get that.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I have read in various histories, for example, that, from antiquity onward, that, well, especially in antiquity, that the northern coast of Africa, specifically around modern day Tunisia and places in Morocco and the northern Algerian coast, were much more fertile than it has been in modern times. But I have also come across this with Andrew Davies and a few other historians that, the demand for materials for larger ships does, in fact, demand a high degree of timber. And there is some, at least according to, it's either Andrew Davies or, I forget his name. I'll think of it here in a moment. But a historian had stipulated that there was evidence from shipwreck that what was recovered from a Carthaginian shipwreck was basically almost like ancient equivalents of receipts for ordering timber from the Iberians. Now, whether or not that's from the Punic era is totally up for debate and will probably never be solved. But you do see this this merchant, import of timber going into Carthage from external places like the Iberian Peninsula and Gallic regions and things like that. So that is something that's interesting to consider. But I think a lot of people, and when we grow up playing strategy games, it's almost as if there's this general theme and motif that bigger is always better. But that's definitely not the case with naval warfare in this age, because again, the build quality just hadn't reached its level that it had in the Age of Sail. And if you look at the design differences, it's quite apparent that that the English and the French and the Spaniards, the evolution of shipbuilding is just it's kind of mind-boggling how much more diligence is put into the build, and all of the sort of, I don't know if you want to call them fail safes, but the designs of the ships in the Age of Sail were designed to put up with weather, and they didn't rot nearly as quickly due to how things were waterproofed and things like that. So these navies, as you had mentioned earlier, both the Romans and the Carthaginians were building ships as fast as they could. There might be something to be said for the ecological argument that many of these places were deforested, and that's something that the Carthaginians could not have sustained as long, whereas Italy is made much more of, there's much more timber and pines and things like that all throughout Italy. So that's something that the Romans could have afforded to do, but I don't think the Carthaginians could have. I think one other thing I'll say too is that I think the Romans did a really good job of training their crews better, because this is something Polybius had pointed out, is that the Romans became less willing to lose these men at sea, because it's one thing to train up a legion and to have them drill certain formations, flanking maneuvers and all that. It's kind of an entirely different thing to have a crew of a trireme sort of act as one entity. That's just kind of naval warfare is just kind of a different thing altogether. And so it's difficult to develop into a political power or an empire to raise enough money to get a navy in general. It's a completely other step to achieve some level of quality. And obviously they had some growing pains with battles like Drepana. But as you see in the Battle of Mylae and Agates, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, you see this introduction of more elaborate tactics and a more careful use of naval assets, because it seemed apparent at first that the Romans didn't necessarily mind. I mean, of course, they preferred victory and glory, but they were fine with losing a lot of ships because they could just throw more at that. They could throw more numbers at it rather than change the quality. But I think that's what makes Rome so deadly throughout history, is its willingness to change and innovate. Whereas you see a lot of these powers like Persia and Sparta that just have a sort of fixed and static worldview in terms of warfare. And I think that's why a lot of those, among other things like economics and culture and a whole host of other subjects, that those powers ended up failing. But that's, I think, why Rome lasted as long as it did. And that certainly extends to naval power here against the Carthaginians in the Punic War. And the one last thing I'll say too is that the quadremes, the quinqueremes, and triremes, I think they can generally be viewed as, it was either with Alexander or it was with Demetrius, depending on the conqueror or commander in question. Many of these ships to them were viewed as sort of universal war-making vehicles, by which I mean, there's some evidence it was either Demetrius or Alexander. I could do a little bit more homework on this, but it was one of these commanders that decided to put on siege towers on their ships. Others were, strictly used as, missile fire ships with ballistae and catapults. And then others are simply viewed as more amphibious with, beaching ships and, conducting a land campaign from there. So, they weren't just used for exclusive naval war. They were used as anything from logistic to siege and everything else in between. So I think that's important for the military historian to keep in mind as far as these different types of ships go.
Yeah, I'll just end by saying that the First Punic War, and up to this point, is both the climax and the beginning of the end of the giant naval vessels in the ancient Mediterranean. Thanks again, Terminal Philosophy. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Looking forward to the next one.
Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This is Todd Lewis of the Prize of Folly podcast, signing off.